I never planned to come back to this town. Standing near the shore again felt like reopening a wound that had barely learned to close. The sea looked the same, calm on the surface, hiding its pull underneath. I told myself this was only temporary. A short stay. A favor for an old friend. Nothing more. That lie was the first betrayal. Even before I crossed paths with him again. My marriage had already been cracking long before I left the city. On paper, everything looked stable. Shared bills. Shared routines. Shared silences. My husband and I moved around each other like polite strangers. Careful not to collide. Careful not to ask the wrong questions. Love had quietly packed its bags years ago. But loyalty stayed behind, stubborn and heavy. Or maybe it was fear that stayed. Fear of starting over. Fear of admitting that comfort had replaced connection. The invitation to return here came unexpectedly. A message. Simple. Almost casual. I heard you're nearby. If you ever come back, let me know. I stared at the name longer than I should have. I didn't reply. Not right away. I told myself it meant nothing. That the past was buried. But the past has a way of breathing when you think it's dead. When I finally arrived, everything felt smaller. The roads. The houses. Even the memories seemed closer together, stacked tightly in my chest. I avoided familiar places, but avoidance only sharpened my awareness. Every sound reminded me of a version of myself I used to be. Someone braver. Someone who felt things without measuring the consequences. First. We met by accident, or at least that's what I told myself. A brief glance. Pause that lasted too long. No dramatic words. No sudden confessions. Just recognition. The kind that settles in your bones. He looked different, older in a way that felt earned, but his eyes were the same. Still observant. Still gentle. Still dangerous to my peace. We talked like people who knew each other too well to pretend otherwise. Safe topics at first. Work. Time. Weather. But underneath every sentence was the awareness of what had once been left unsaid. He didn't ask about my marriage. I didn't volunteer anything. Silence did most of the talking, and it said enough that night. Alone in the guest room I'd borrowed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the waves. I thought about vows. About promises made with certainty that fades when life tests them. I thought about how easy it would be to cross a line without touching it yet. Emotional honesty feels harmless when you're starving for it. That realization scared me more than desire ever could. I knew I should leave. I also knew I wouldn't. Something had already shifted the moment I came back. Not because of what had happened, but because of what might. Infidelity doesn't always begin with touch. Sometimes it begins with memory, with longing, with choosing not to walk away when you still can. And as the sea kept moving outside, steady and patient, I understood that I was standing at the edge of something I might not be strong enough to resist. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm I didn't question enough. Messages came more often than they should have. Short at first, practical, harmless. Then longer. Warmer. He remembered things my husband never did. How I took my tea. How silence made me anxious. How I used humor to dodge questions that felt too close. Each detail felt like proof that I still existed to someone. I told myself it was innocent because nothing physical had happened. No hands, no lips, no stolen nights. Just words. Just attention. But words have weight, and attention is intimate when it's focused the way his was. When I spoke to my husband on the phone, our conversations felt like chores. With him they felt like relief. That contrast became impossible to ignore. There was a moment, quiet and unremarkable, when I realized I was waiting for his messages. Not hoping. Waiting. Structuring my time around them. Feeling disappointed when minutes passed without a reply. That scared me, but not enough to stop. Instead, I justified it. I told myself everyone needs a friend. That loneliness inside marriage doesn't count as betrayal if you never act on it. He never pushed. That made it worse. His restraint felt respectful. And respect is seductive when you feel unseen. He listened without fixing me. He asked questions my husband avoided. When I spoke about feeling trapped, he didn't tell me to be grateful. He told me I made sense. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. The attraction didn't arrive loudly. It crept in quietly, wrapped in familiarity and trust. I caught myself noticing the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way his presence steadied me. the way my body reacted before my mind could intervene. I had never allowed myself to think in those directions before. The confusion unsettled me. Desire didn't fit the labels I'd lived by, and that made it easier to deny and harder to resist. I tried to pull back. I delayed replies. I shortened conversations. I reminded myself of vows and consequences. But distance only sharpened the ache. When he noticed, he didn't confront me. He simply said he hoped I was okay. That concern cracked something open. Guilt followed immediately, heavy and persistent. But guilt has never been a strong enough anchor on its own. Meanwhile, my marriage continued to erode quietly. My husband sensed the shift but misread it as stress. He offered solutions instead of presence, advice instead of intimacy. I realized how long I had been translating my needs into silence for him, and how easily they surfaced with someone else. That realization felt like betrayal even before any lines were crossed. One evening, our conversation drifted somewhere vulnerable. Not explicit, not reckless, just honest in a way that removed plausible deniability. We acknowledged the pull without naming it, acknowledged the risk without stepping away. That was the moment I understood that emotional fidelity had already slipped through my fingers. I went to sleep knowing I was standing between two truths. One was familiar, safe, and empty. The other was uncertain, alive, and dangerous. Desire had nothing to do with bodies yet. It lived in attention, in validation, in the quiet decision to keep choosing him over restraint. And deep down, I knew that once you allow yourself to feel seen by someone else, the rest becomes a matter of time. I stopped pretending that balance was possible. Every choice began to lean in his direction, even when I tried to correct it. I compared without meaning to. His patience against my husband's distraction. His curiosity against my husband's certainty. The comparison felt unfair, but it happened anyway, quietly rewriting my loyalty. I wasn't falling out of love so much as realizing how long I'd been falling without noticing that we met more often, always with reasons that sounded responsible. Coffee to talk. A walk to clear my head. Time passed differently around him, stretching and shrinking in ways that made me forget where I was supposed to be. I noticed how my guard lowered without effort, how my laughter came easier. None of it crossed the obvious line, which made it easier to deny that a line existed at all. The tension lived in pauses, in glances that lingered a second too long, in conversations that ended reluctantly, like we were both waiting for something neither of us dared to ask for. I became hyper-aware of myself around him, not in a performative way but in a way that felt newly discovered. As if some part of me had been dormant and was slowly waking up. At home, the contrast sharpened into discomfort. My husband tried in his way. He noticed my distance and responded with effort that felt scheduled, not instinctive. Dinners planned. Apologies offered too late. I recognized the pattern because I'd lived inside it for years, telling myself that effort counted, even when connection didn't follow. Now, effort felt like a reminder of how much I'd settled. The guilt arrived in waves. It showed up when my husband reached for me and I felt absent, when he spoke about the future and I pictured an emptiness instead of a shared vision. I hadn't confessed anything, but my thoughts felt like evidence. I wondered if emotional betrayal required witnesses, or if intention alone was enough to condemn me. The night everything shifted, nothing dramatic happened. No confession. No touch. Just honesty, stripped of its protective layers. We spoke about regret. About the lives we thought we'd have. About how easily people lose themselves trying to be dependable. When I admitted how trapped I felt, he didn't offer escape. He offered understanding. That was enough to undo me. I realized then that my attraction wasn't about replacing my husband. It was about recognizing parts of myself I'd abandoned to keep peace. The realization carried an unexpected tenderness. Desire felt less like hunger and more like recognition. That frightened me more than lust ever could, because recognition asks you to change. I went home knowing a decision was forming, even if I hadn't named it yet. Staying meant continuing to disappear slowly. Leaving meant hurting someone who had done nothing unforgivable. Neither option felt clean. Infidelity, I learned, isn't always about choosing someone else. Sometimes it's about choosing yourself too late, after your heart has already stepped beyond the boundaries you promised to respect. As I lay awake, I understood that denial had expired. Whatever came next would demand action or consequence. The quiet middle was gone. And once that space disappears, everything becomes painfully clear, even when the right choice still feels impossible. The truth finally surfaced not through confrontation, but through exhaustion. Carrying two emotional realities had begun to hollow me out. I was present everywhere and nowhere at once. My husband noticed first, not because I confessed, but because absence has a texture you can't hide forever. He asked what was wrong in a voice that suggested he already knew something was broken. Even if he didn't know what I wanted to lie. I wanted to simplify it into stress or distance or time. But lies had brought me here, and I was too tired to keep maintaining them. I told him I was unhappy. Not recently. Not suddenly. For a long time. I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. The look on his face carried the weight of all the moments he'd missed and all the warnings he'd ignored. Hurt mixed with disbelief. Then with a quiet anger that didn't explode but settled between us like fog. That night, nothing was resolved. We spoke in fragments, circling truths neither of us wanted to touch directly. He asked if there was someone else. I said not in the way he meant. That answer hurt him more than a simple confession would have. Emotional infidelity doesn't leave clear evidence, only questions that echo without answers. The days that followed forced clarity. I stopped messaging him. Not dramatically. Not with a farewell. I simply chose silence and let it stand where I had once stood. It was painful in a way that felt necessary, like setting a bone that had healed wrong. He respected the distance, which somehow made it harder. No anger. No accusations. Just acceptance, heavy and matured. Why marriage didn't survive, but it didn't collapse either. It ended slowly, with honesty replacing pretense. We acknowledged that love had faded into obligation, and obligation had turned into quiet resentment. There was grief but also relief. Some relationships don't end because of betrayal, they end because they outgrow the people inside them. Leaving felt like stepping into open water. No guarantees. No familiar shoreline to cling to. I didn't run toward him. I didn't replace one certainty with another. I stayed alone longer than I wanted to, learning the shape of myself without compromise. Learning how desire can inform you without directing you. Learning that being seen isn't the same as being saved. Eventually, I returned to the shore one last time. Not to rekindle anything, but to close it properly. We spoke honestly without tension or expectation. What existed between us had been real, but it had served its purpose. It had shown me where I was starving and where I needed to heal. Sometimes people enter your life not to stay, but to wake you up. I left with no promises made and none broken further. Infidelity had taken many forms in my story, but the deepest betrayal had been to myself, staying silent for too long. Love doesn't always end with someone else's arms. Sometimes it ends with the courage to walk away. Even when desire is pulling you toward an easier life, the waves pulled back from the shore. I understood that peace doesn't come from choosing the least painful option. Comes from choosing the most honest one. And for the first time in a long while, honesty felt like solid ground.